Welcome to the State Library. My name is Alyssa Pearson, and I'm the Special Collections Processing Librarian here. We are so happy you joined us for today's author talk and would like to take this opportunity to thank the House Broadcast Services for their help with this event. Today, we are thrilled to welcome historian and associate professor Dr. Kerri Greenidge. Dr. Greenidge is Mellon Associate Professor in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University, where she also co-directs the African American Trail Project and Tufts Slavery, Colonialism, and Their Legacies Project. As a public historian, Greenidge serves on the Scholars Council for 10 Million Names, and as historical advisor for the Museum of African American History, Boston, and Nantucket. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times, Massachusetts Historical Review, the Radical History Review, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Guardian. Greenidge is the award-winning author of Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, and is co-author of the forthcoming Black Atlas with Dr. Kendra Field. Prior to her career in academia, Greenidge was a historian at Boston African American National Historic Site. Greenidge's ties to Boston and New England run deep. Her maternal great-grandfather was one of the first Black graduates of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire and a member of William Monroe Trotter's Boston-based National Equal Rights League. Her maternal grandparents owned property in the South End, participated in the local NAACP and the equal education efforts of the 1950s and 60s, and supported various Boston civil rights organizations of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Greenidge's paternal family migrated from Barbados to Cambridge, where their children were among the first tenured Black teachers in the Cambridge public schools. The Grimkes, The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family, which Dr. Greenidge is here to speak about today, is a landmark biography and counter-narrative of the well-known abolitionist Grimke Sisters that reclaims the forgotten Black members of their family. It was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Award, and the J. Anthony Lucas Award. It was also a finalist for the 2023 MAH Stone Book Award, a finalist for the Harriet Tubman Award from the Schaumburg Library, and the recipient of the 2023 Joan Kelly Memorial Prize from the American Historical Association. Before Dr. Greenidge begins, I want to note that this talk is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in a few days. She'll speak for 30 to 45 minutes, and then there will be time for questions. For the Q&A portion, a staff member will walk around with a microphone for you to use since this talk is being recorded so that everyone can hear. And we have assisted listening devices available if you need one. Without further ado, I am happy to present Dr. Kerri Greenidge.
Thank you so much, guys, and thank you for having me. As the introduction stated, my heart and stuff, I'm a mass hole through and through. So I love doing talks at the Massachusetts State House and City Hall and stuff. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to begin with a little bit of a story. There are a lot of characters in this book, and I think my talk and the stories that I'm going to tell will illustrate how it is that I chose to focus on the history of this family. So this is the book cover. So in the fall of 1906, when she was 26 years old, this woman named Angelina Weld Grimke arrived in Charleston, South Carolina for the first time. The occasion was the 40th anniversary of the Avery Institute, the first accredited secondary school for Black people in Charleston. Originally called the Tappan School, after the New York abolitionist Lewis Tappan, who helped found it, Avery had long been a source of pride for Black Charleston. The first heads of the school, free Black brothers Thomas and Francis Cardozo, descended from those who Angelina's grandmother, Nancy Weston, referred to as quote-unquote colored Westons. Here's Avery School. Here's her grandmother, Nancy Weston. Grandmother Nancy Weston was not free until Union troops reclaimed Charleston in 1865. Still, she raised her sons, Angelina's father, Archibald Grimke, her uncle Francis J. Grimke, and their little brother John, to believe in the exceptionalism of this antebellum free Black community. The greatest blood of the South flows through your veins, she often told the boys during those long-ago days in their one-room house on Cumming Street. And by this, she meant not only the quote-unquote colored Westons, but the white Grimke family who claimed to own them. The colored Westons, again in quotes, helped found Avery Institute in 1866, and now 40 years later, Angelina's father and uncle returned to Charleston as the most famous Grimkes in the country to congratulate the Avery Institute's graduating class of newly minted black teachers. Here she is with her father. There are the boys after the Civil War, and there they are as adults. That spring in 1906, however, as Angelina spent the days after Avery's graduation touring the city with her father and uncle, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that remained unsaid behind the pomp and circumstance of the Avery ceremony. One of the most concerning things for Angelina was the fact that she saw little evidence of the white Grimkes, the source of that supposed, quote, great blood of the South, whose exceptionalism once sat on the South Carolina Supreme Court and in the Charleston mayor's office. Quote, there is a tale there to tell indeed, she wrote to a friend, but, quote, alas, I will never decipher it, although it sweeps over me heavily. How I wish, she concluded, I had a mother to tell me what I want to know. When Angelina Weld Grimke took that trip to Charleston in 1906, the Grimke name was well known amongst members of W.E.B. Du Bois's so-called talented tenth. Angelina's father, Archibald Henry Grimke, who you see here on your left, was a graduate of Harvard Law School, a successful attorney, a newspaper editor, and a political appointee who led the black political independence movement right here in Massachusetts in the 1880s. By 1906, Archibald, called Archie, had served as consul to the Dominican Republic under Democratic President Grover Cleveland. This was at a time when most African Americans were registered Republican. And he founded D.C.'s prestigious American Negro Academy with W.E.B. Du Bois and Alexander Crummell. Angelina Weld Grimke's uncle, Francis James Grimke, who is also in this picture, was called Frank, and Frank's wife, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, were equally accomplished. A graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, Frank was pastor of D.C.'s exclusive 15th Street Presbyterian Church, the gathering spot for black former congressmen, real estate investors, university administrators, and federal appointees. Aunt Lottie, granddaughter of one of antebellum America's wealthiest black abolitionists, was the first black woman to graduate from a predominantly white college, a veteran social reformer who taught freed people on the South Carolina Sea Islands during Reconstruction, and the first black woman published in the Atlantic Monthly. There's the brothers. There's Aunt Charlotte. With her Grimke name, family pedigree, Angelina Weld Grimke, called Nana, was also on her way to greatness, despite years of adolescent conflict with her father, aunt, and uncle over, quote, her inappropriate relationships, unquote, with women. As a graduate of the Boston Normal School of Gymnastics, a predecessor to Wellesley College, and as a published writer whose poetry frequently appeared in The Colored American, The Boston Pilot, and Scribner's, Nana taught English at D.C.'s prestigious Dunbar High School. She studied casually at Harvard University in the summer, and she spent vacations and holidays gallivanting around the Jersey Shore and Anacostia, Maryland, with her equally well-heeled friends, some of whom and most of whom were the children of black office holders, administrators, and elected officials in D.C. Like many African Americans at the turn of the last century, particularly the so-called colored elite in cities like D.C., Philadelphia, and Boston, Nana Grimke was the granddaughter of both the enslaved and the enslaver. There are the Grimke Sisters. I'll come back to them in a second. There is Angelina Weld Grimke on the left, African American, and there is her cousin, also named Angelina Weld Hamilton, on the right. Yet she was also the grandniece of two of antebellum America's most famous white women reformers, Sarah Grimke, born in 1792, and Angelina Grimke Weld, born in 1805. They were two of 13 children born to one of the wealthiest and most politically influential slaveholding families in the South Carolina Lowcountry. During the 1830s, the sisters earned acclaim amongst New England's anti-slavery leaders for daring to speak publicly against, quote, the peculiar institution in which they'd been raised. In fact, Sarah's 1838 treatise, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes, became canonical texts in the anti-slavery and women's rights movements. In 1838, after nearly a year of touring the South and speaking on the duties of white women in public reform, Angelina Grimke became the first American-born woman to speak before a state government right here in this building when she addressed the Massachusetts state legislature on the need for immediate emancipation and women's right to political representation. After Angelina married the radical anti-slavery activist Theodore Dwight Weld, the sisters moved to rural New Jersey, where they raised Angelina's children, ran a series of reform-oriented and integrated schools for children of the abolitionist movement, and where they continued to host women's rights activists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Known as, quote, the first founders of women's rights, according to their 1970s biographer Gary Lerner, the Grimke sisters were lauded by their contemporaries for supposedly, quote, disavowing their birthright and sacrificing their wealth to support, quote, the cause of the slave. These are the facts that we know about the Grimke family. The accomplished black Grimke brothers, Archie and Frank, who led black America at the turn of the last century, Archie's daughter, the brilliant poet-playwright Angelina Weld Grimke, and the selfless and uncompromising women's rights activists Sarah and Angelina Grimke, whose lives have inspired one novel, numerous historical monographs, and seats of honor in national and local women's rights museums across the country. And yet, as Nana Grimke pointed out in 1906 after her visit to the Avery Institute in Charleston, there is more of a, quote, tale there than historians and the general public have previously acknowledged. And this was one of the things I sought to do in my book. How was it, for instance, that Angelina and Sarah Grimke, who you see here, professed horror and, quote, feelings of deception when they discovered their black nephews while reading an article in the National Anti-Slavery Standard in 1868? This is the story that historians have grabbed onto, right? That they're 1868, they're sitting in their house in Hyde Park, a few miles from here, and they read and see the name Grimke, and that these black sons whose last name is Grimke, have graduated. According to the Grimke sisters, and repeated by countless historians, they first read about Archie and Frank in an article about Lincoln University, the black college located in rural Pennsylvania that the brothers attended after the Civil War. According to Angelina, she and Sarah were, quote, horrified to discover that their brother Henry Grimke fathered 3 boys with his enslaved nurse, Nancy Weston. It was this horror that led them, or so the story goes, to meet the brothers, to welcome them into their home in Hyde Park, and to eventually help pay for their education at Lincoln and for Archie's tuition to Harvard Law School. But according to all of the available historical records, letters, diaries, accounts by family members and acquaintances, Henry Grimke, their brother, was a particularly brutal and sadistic slaveholder, much of which I recount in the book. As a child, he delighted in banging slave boys' heads against door jambs, causing one enslaved man, Stephen, to suffer permanent brain damage, which eventually meant that the white Grimkes begged Sarah and Angelina to bring him north. Brutalized by Henry throughout his life, Stephen, the enslaved man, suffered from fits and seizures as a grown man, which meant that he wouldn't, quote, fetch a good price, according to the Grimkes, on the market. Sarah, Angelina, and 2 of their other sisters eventually arranged for Stephen to live with them in New Jersey, an act of supposed selflessness that was actually revealing for how unsympathetic the 2 white women remained about their family's culpability in slavery's inherent brutality. When Stephen arrived in New Jersey, for instance, and couldn't work, due in part to the permanent brain damage wrought by Henry's violence, the sisters complained that he was, quote, lazy and shiftless. While publicly providing him with a home and a place to stay, they constantly filled letters with diatribes against how lazy he had become since becoming free. Then there was the matter of the Grimke brothers themselves, men who ascended the ranks of the talented 10th only to reveal in private letters, diaries, and public speeches their disdain for those they referred to as, quote unquote, the Negro masses. Yes. Raised by their mother, Nancy Weston, to see themselves as exceptional, to believe that they were, quote, colored Westons, and that, quote, the greatest blood of the South flowed through their veins, both Frank and Archie used the same derogatory language that Sarah and Angelina used when talking about the lowly slave to describe what the brothers saw as the, quote, creeping immorality and, quote, looming irrespectability of those they called the majority of our colored people. As pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, for instance, Frank transformed that institution, founded by John F. Cook in 1841, from a welcoming congregation of all classes of colored people, as it was called, into a bastion of postbellum color politics, to use the words of one of its most famous parishioners, Blanche K. Bruce. Although Grimke transformed 15th Street Presbyterian into a vibrant center of civil rights activism, he also policed his parishioners' private lives, suspending women members for supposed impropriety, and publicly criticized working class and darker-skinned black residents for their supposed shiftlessness and tendency to, quote, hang bare-armed out of windows and give the white citizens every reason to distrust us, end quote. Similarly, as consul to the Dominican Republic, Archie often referred to the Dominican peasants as incapable of self-government. and, quote, in need of economic intervention from the Yankee businessman, sounding more like a racist white northerner overseeing the confiscation of freedmen's lands than a black man dedicated to racial equality. It was through Archie's negotiations with the violent government of both the U.S. and the Dominican Republic that U.S. businessmen seized Dominican land for sugar plantations that eventually facilitated America's colonial violence in that country well into the 20th century. Finally, there is the question of how they treated the women in their lives, despite Archie's support for women's suffrage and Frank's public reputation for supporting the National Association of Colored Women. Frank married Charlotte Fortin. Where is she? Frank married Charlotte Fortin, a fourth-generation Philadelphia abolitionist and public intellectual in her own right, but he discouraged her from continuing her public writing after the couple's first and only child, a daughter named Theodora, died in infancy. Although privately devoted to Lottie and proud of her past accomplishments, Frank feared that, quote, the exposure of a pastor's wife, end quote, could jeopardize the respectability of the church that he led. And so Lottie spent the last 40 years of her life as a, quote, colored society lady, supporting equally brilliant and publicly minded black intellectual women like Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell. Archie, meanwhile, raised his daughter Nana with every advantage that his money and political influence could buy. Yet his relentless criticism of Nana's passion for poetry and novels, of her supposed laziness in school, and particularly of her, quote, inappropriate relationships with women, meant that Nana Grimke grew up constantly failing to meet the requirement of a colored elite obsessed with racial respectability. When Nana fell in love with a man, for instance, an attraction that Archie, Frank, and Lottie had consistently wished for, following Nana's unapologetic love for various female classmates, Archie threatened to cut her out of his life forever. The black man Archie insisted was, quote unquote, too dark, his work as a musician, quote, entirely unsuitable for the life that I am building for you. And then there is the matter of Angelina Weld Grimke, the prolific poet and prose writer whose 1916 play Rachel provides a searing indictment of black women's possibilities in an age of unrelenting racial violence and economic marginalization wrought by Reconstruction's collapse and the rise of Jim Crow. The play tells the story of Rachel Loving and her family, who live in an unnamed northern city at the turn of the century. As Rachel and her brother struggle to earn a living in the face of constant white obstruction, they are haunted by a family secret. In the play, this secret is told to them at the beginning of Act 1 when their mother, stricken with melancholy as she prepares dinner, confesses that when Rachel and her brother were babies, their father and half-brother were brutally lynched by an angry white mob in the South. The remainder of the play shows Rachel as she slowly comes to terms with her family history and as she realizes that her life in the North is as equally restricted by white racial animosity and institutionalized segregation as the Jim Crow society from which her mother fled. The climax of the play is a harrowing scene in which Rachel, driven mad by her racial reality, vows never to have children of her own, given the inescapable violence of white supremacy. When Rachel premiered, marketed by the NAACP as an anti-lynching play, black male critics were often critical of the play's vengeful tone, as they called it. Yes. But the colored woman is the future of the race, wrote one particularly horrified writer in the Chicago Broadax. To abdicate her responsibility is to succumb to the white man. But Grimke, a queer black woman whose ambitions were often misunderstood and denied by her famous family, spent a lifetime writing about all the things that upwardly mobile colored society refused to mention. This included the existential rage and sometimes suffocating pressures wrought by racial respectability and the conservative restraints that it placed on black women. Grimke was one of many black women writers of the so-called Harlem Renaissance who challenged us to reconceptualize that era as thoroughly queer and female as it was black. I propose that Angelina Grimke's work in particular offers us an example of the power of black literature as a way to more fully understand the gaps that exist in the historical archive when it comes to African American biography and family history. Take, for example, one of Grimke's most anthologized poems, Tenebris. First published in 1924, the title recalls, there's her Uncle Weld. Come back to him in a second. The title recalls the Latin phrase lux in tenebris, or light in darkness, from the first book of John, verse 5. The verse describes Jesus as a light in the darkness that humankind does not comprehend. In Grimke's rendering, tenebris has multiple meanings. It is the actual darkness of a tree's shadow, but it is also the symbolic black hand that plucks and plucks, quote unquote, at a white man's house. Tenebris is also an allusion to, quote, the white man's failure to fully comprehend the black hand of justice that seeks accountability for the racial sins of the recent past. Tenebris, here it is. There is a tree by day that at night has a shadow, a hand huge and black, with fingers long and black, all through the dark against the white man's house. In the little wind, the black hand plucks and plucks at the bricks. The bricks are the color of blood and very small. Is it a black hand or is it a shadow? As Grimke shows in Tenebris and Rachel and in her hundreds of writings, only a fraction of which have ever been published, the power of black literature lies in the ability to express the things that the world at large deems inexpressible. In Grimke's case, like so many of her contemporaries, and I would argue even today, the most inexpressible thing was the racial past in all of its personal horrors and familial traumas. As a child of the colored elite, Grimke's so-called inappropriate relationships with women were forbidden, for instance. Yet in her poetry, Grimke could openly admire pretty black girls and fantasize about all the women she kissed or dreamt of kissing. Even more telling, Grimke could allude to in her poetry, to the pain of a colored elite that descended from the sexual exploitation, violence, and horrors of antebellum slavery. And so this is the role of black biography and a book like I completed in the Grimkes. It brings the skills of trained historians to analyze all aspects of black life, the good, the bad, the ugly, in order to challenge an archive that was never built for us in the first place. The Grimkes, the legacy of slavery in an American family, explores these complexities of what the scholar Saidiya Hartman calls slavery's afterlives by asking questions that are as important today as we reap the effects of late-stage capitalism and the failed compromises of the civil rights and Obama era as they were in the Grimke brothers' time. How does the racial and sexual violence of Southern slavery continue to affect families, communities, and the ways in which black people communicate with and understand our blackness? What was the real cost of birthing a post-bellum colored elite from the rampant sexual exploitation of enslaved black women by slaveholding white men? And what does it mean that capitalist accumulation, supposed economic success, and professional achievement have never been enough to deliver us from America's racial abyss? Thank you. Open it for questions. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. I look forward to reading the Grimkes. In Black Radical, what I admire very much is that you are very even-handed in looking at the life of William Monroe Trotter. And I wondered, as a biographer, how you managed to avoid writing a hagiography about someone who you've spent so many hours delving into their life and understanding why they did what they did.
It's a good question. I think, so one of my mentors is David Levering Lewis, who is the only person to win back-to-back Pulitzer Prizes for biography. He won it for his two-part biography of W.E.B. Du Bois. And he always says, that you can't fall in love with your subject as much as you might love your subject, right? And you have to use every single source that is possibly available to evaluate their lives, even when you think you've uncovered a saint in your research, right? Because people are not saints, right? Nobody is, right? And so anybody you're writing about, even somebody whose politics you might admire or whose, essay you quote to your students, right? It doesn't mean that their lives were absolved, and that you could actually use people's lives to examine the contours of like a historical context. And so for the Trotter book, I really wanted to look at how he exemplified a city, Boston, after the Civil War, but also how, as an activist, he became somebody eventually who couldn't get out of his own way. And so the dangers that often happens with people who have worked in radical activist spaces for many, many years. I have many of them in my family, wonderful, radically minded people, and yet what is the toll that takes on somebody just in terms of their everyday if they've been in the trenches for like 40 years, right? And so I really wanted to discuss that, and in that then you start to see, the mistakes, not even mistakes, but just the life that accumulates. And with the Grimkes, it was a similar thing. I was somebody who did not go into writing the book thinking that I would end up disliking all aspects of the Grimkes, black side, white side, all of them, as I did. I really was just, really wanted to explore, as I say in the book, what does it mean that you have the most famous white women anti-slavery activists have nephews who then, after the Civil War, become these famous black leaders. And as a historian, many scholars never mentioning that unless it's a footnote, right? And never kind of delving into that dynamic and what that might have meant for everybody involved, right? Both for the Grimke brothers who are black and they're growing up and they're hearing these stories about their family, but they're also remembering the reality of growing up enslaved in Charleston. And for the white descendants of the Grimkes who grew up hearing the same stories, and yet there's a lot of pain and sort of unanswered questions that many of them have about, just how their family came to be. Yes.
So I'm curious, do any of your family members show up in either of these books?
They don't actually. I will say this. So I became a historian mostly because of my grandparents. So my grandmother and grandfather. My grandmother was born in Portsmouth. She was the one whose father went to Dartmouth graduated in 1918, and he had 8 children. So she was one of 8 and grew up as a black young girl in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at the turn of the century. And I married my grandfather, who was a World War II veteran. From Virginia, and they moved to the South End in the 1940s, and they raised their children, and they moved eventually to Arlington, and became some of the first black families to purchase property, and then they rented it to Italians and black people who people in Arlington didn't like at the time. So anyway, that was their background, but they did not have, my grandfather at least did not have beyond 10th grade education, but he read everything, and he studied everything, and he would go into archives and just for fun go in and read about people and try to discover. This was before Google or anything like that. So he'd go and get his library card, and he got us all his grandkids' library cards by the time we were 4, and would say you have to look in there's a primary source and there's a secondary source, and how he knew this having the education he had is phenomenal. But one of the things he would point out is that Trotter and the Grimkes were people that he, given his age and given the times he grew up in and given how he was raised just as a person, both in Virginia and then coming to Massachusetts, he knew descendants of these people. So he knew, for instance, William Monroe Trotter's sister, Maud Trotter Stewart, who died in 1957. She was still alive when my grandparents were young people with their kids living in the South End. So they remembered these people. It wasn't an abstract thing. They remembered, my grandmother remembered Angelina Grimke, Weld Grimke, the poet, because Angelina Weld Grimke died in 1958, and she still lived as a recluse in New York City. And she would have, people in the black community go and get her food because she was too afraid to leave her house, right? So I grew up sort of hearing of these people less as iconic people who you didn't know, and more about through my grandparents at least, talking about them like they were real people. And so it's a roundabout way of saying that I think that a lot, even though my family members are not directly in it, a lot of the descriptions of, Boston and in particular, but also Philadelphia and to a lesser extent Charleston, come from, going through stuff that my own family members wrote about those places and talked about those places and what they remember about how Boston looked like when my grandmother first came here when she was 15 years old in 1930, and she talks about, what the streets looked like and, what the neighborhoods looked like, and very, very different look. And so really absorbing that and then, of course, going to the historical record and then using that to flesh out the story.
I was wondering if while you were researching for the Grimkes, if there were any questions that were left unanswered for you that you were trying to find out, or anything that was particularly striking to you or surprising while you were researching?
It's a good question. I think 2 things. I think most striking thing to me was that when I was researching the book and going through all of the archives of the Grimke family that are at the Clements Library at University of Michigan, and going through the letters that they were writing back and forth and seeing written down how blatant the violence was in their household underneath slavery and how it was talked about very casually, and being very conscious of, well, why haven't historians talked about this? Because it wasn't hard to find. It's not like I'm going in and I'm like, this is a document no one's seen before. It's like it's all in there, right? And so I think that was shocking, not shocking, but sobering to me to realize that, historians work from the sources they have, but it's also how they're interpreting the sources. And so if you're somebody who's not trained in the history of slavery, for instance, it's easy for you to read about the Grimke sisters talking about growing up in Charleston and the horrible heat, and taking that at face value, and not seeing the fact that from the records they had enslaved women who were assigned to fan them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? And they kind of mention them in some of the letters, but what does that actually mean? That your life is, you're in a place, you're in Charleston, South Carolina, it's 18, teens, and surrounding you constantly are black people doing work, right? And they're kind of the invisible hand, as people call it, right? And so that's a very real thing, and that's in there. So I think that was surprising to me. And I think I want somebody to do a biography of Angelina Weld Grimke herself, because she had a sort of fascinating life as a poet, and her uncle and father died by the end of the 1930s, and she lived another 20 years. And she continued to write. She lived in New York. She was a recluse, right? So she moved to New York. She lived there, and there's stories of people like getting her food because she refused to leave the house, right? And she was very sort of paranoid about stuff. And so, what is her story? And her writings. All of her papers are at the Moreland Spingarn Library at Howard University in D.C. And as scholars, we've only scratched the surface of all the stuff she wrote. She wrote her first poem when she's like 6 years old. It's like brilliant. To her mother, who was a white woman from Michigan. And she writes a poem when she's 8 years old about the lakes in Michigan. I mean, she's brilliant. And so somebody needs to do a very, 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 detailed tap into her, because I don't think I was able, time constraints of the book, to sort of tap into that. And I think that somebody who does that, right, it's going to sort of change the way people look at literature of that time.
Well, since we are in a library, I was curious, you mentioned a little about how a lot of the papers for the family are in Michigan.
Clements Library, Michigan, yeah.
But I was curious about where these sources are, and also if you know how they ended, how did they end up in Michigan?
I'm not exactly sure of all the details, but the Clements Library in Michigan, for those of you who do research, there's many, many libraries and repositories for resources, and Clements Library is top notch in the world. It's sort of one of those places. So Angelina Grimke Weld, who married Theodore Weld, who was a radical abolitionist, they had 3 children. The daughter in that family, Sarah Grimke, ended up getting married to a minister who moved to Michigan. And that family was very involved in the Methodist Church in northern Michigan. And Sarah Grimke, the daughter of Angelina Grimke, became sort of the family, kept a lot of the family papers, meticulously chronicled her brother's mental illness. So one of the things in the book is that Angelina Grimke had 3 children. The youngest one, Theodore, who they called Sodi, it's 2024, we can't really diagnose what he had, but started hearing voices as early as, 12 years old, and was severely mentally ill, right? Something that, the literature doesn't talk about, but is all over their correspondence with one another, and they're getting these advice on, anyone who has somebody in their family who suffers from, mental illness of some sort. They're getting all of this advice about, well, just starve him, right? And he'll not hear the voices. So all of those papers are up at the University of Michigan. The Grimke family, because there were so many of them, Clements Library has the Grimkes, but they have all of the Grimke brothers and siblings in there. University of South Carolina has all of the previous generation of Grimkes. The Grimkes are sort of the founders of and the writers of the South Carolina Constitution after the Revolutionary War, so they're a big family there for a time period. The Moreland Spingarn Library at Howard University, of course. The Boston Public Library here has a lot on them during their time in Boston. Their stuff is everywhere, and particularly because they were so respected in reform circles. Their stuff is not really hard to find, which was one of the amazing things when I was writing the book, because I was told, oh, you're never going to find that stuff, right? And then you go in and you're like, well, it's actually here. It's just the way people are reading stuff that people are missing. Along those lines, I remember going into seeing the correspondence between the Grimke sisters and their other sister about Stephen, the enslaved man. And that had been touched upon kind of in footnotes in other people's work, but hadn't really been explored, like, well, what happens to Stephen? And the historical record, he moves to New Jersey. The Grimkes write letters to newspapers where they're complaining about the fact that, he's shiftless and he's lazy, and, he hasn't really paid attention to the responsibilities of freedom, right? All of that is in there. So I think one of the lessons I take from that is that historians are only as good as their sources, and the sources are only as good as the historian who dives into them and kind of has a context for what they mean, right? And if you're going to school, traditional, becoming a historian nowadays, unless you're trained on the history of slavery and how it changes, there's a lot of things you're going to miss, right? That's just, and it's not the person's fault, if you're not trained in looking into how slavery functioned, you're going to miss certain things, right? Women did not nurse their own children in the South. So when the mother in the letters is complaining about breastfeeding, she's actually complaining about the ways that the breastfeeding affects her enslaved woman, right? And she has two children at the same time. They're both nursing, and how is she going to get the enslaved woman to nurse them both at the same time, right? So that's the conversation that they're having in these letters. They're not talking about the mother who's breastfeeding, right? Because if you study slavery, that didn't happen, right? Very rarely happened for women of their social class that they were going to nurse. And so then you peel back and you start to see the letters where they're talking about this enslaved woman, and they're afraid their child isn't going to be able to eat because the enslaved woman is taking too long nursing the other baby, right? So there's all of this intimate stuff of slavery and what it actually looked like comes out a lot in how people are talking if you know how to look at the sources. Oh, anyone? Any questions?
I have you weave your research on this book or other books into your teaching?
I tend to. I've been very lucky teaching at Tufts in that I've been able to find groups of students who are historically minded, who want to know, are more akin to learning history in the way that I think history should be taught, which is not sort of these huge polemics and, so-and-so is racist, or so-and-so was bad, or so-and-so was a misogynist. Yes, all that is true, right? any point you're in, but then dissecting, like, well, what does that actually mean, right? And so I've been very lucky in that I've had many students who, I always say, they always joke, my last students who just graduated were like, the word for you is complicate, because I'm always like, well, you have to complicate the assumptions you're having about any given person or a place, and you have to go in and use primary sources, and you have to interrogate those sources, right? If you can't find records of enslaved people, then you have to interrogate, well, why weren't records of them kept, right? And that can get you into into sort of other questions. You have to interrogate, issues of class that were going on within communities that I think has become kind of the thing that many historians, at least, my generation, great historians, but they kind of miss that blatant thing, right? The Grimkes were an upper-class white family and an upper-class black family. So the way they talked about people who were not in those classes, they're absorbing this way of sort of essentializing them. So I think teaching my students to be very specific and complicate stories, right? You can have all these conversations about slavery and what it means, but it's a different thing to talk about how slavery actually looked in Charleston versus how it looked in Philadelphia, right? And those are two very different systems. They're both slavery, they're both brutal, and the Grimke sisters existed in both, right? But there was a reason why they chose Philadelphia over Charleston, right? And so being able to go in and kind of, again, complicating the assumptions you might have. And then context, right? I'm always big with my students. every paper. It's like, well, what's the context for this, right? If it's 1843, a woman's options were very, very slim. So to even a white woman's options like the Grimke sisters, who had a lot of advantages and could afford to, like, I'm going to leave and become an activist, and where's the money come? Nobody really knows. It's just kind of they're able to live, right. That's a choice, but you have very few choices. And so, what were actually the choices that somebody had in real time in 1841, right? If you were a mother who has 3 children and you grew up in a slaveholding family, and because you grew up in a slaveholding family, you never learned how to nurse children, which was what part of Angelina's problem. Like, one of her first child actually almost starved because she was like, oh, just leave the baby and somebody will come and feed him, right? And she's living in New Jersey, and her husband, Theodore Weld, is like, that's not going to happen. But that's a real, that shows like how slavery actually functioned, right? And it's not to say poor Angelina Grimke, but it's to say that's the context in which she's sort of raising her children, and then her children grow up and have a very conflicted relationship with her. Well, of course they do, right? Because she's kind of, she's speaking one thing, slavery is bad, and yet basic functioning things underneath a slave society she didn't have to do. So it's I think my students I love because they ask great questions and they have great ideas, and then working with them to, well, are you asking something that is not contextual for the time, or is it contextual for the time, right? And so it's all about context and contingency and complication rather than definitive. This is what happened. This is what it is. Yes.
I'm curious as to how you managed to decode the ever-changing geography of Boston as you tell the story. And so, when you have like the West End, which doesn't exist anymore, the South End, which has been up and down and up again, and Tremont Row is probably under City Hall Plaza.
Exactly.
Dorchester, a rural suburban neighborhood. How do you manage to find out what a neighborhood meant at the time you're setting the story there?
A lot of research with maps. We are fortunate to have I just had a meeting yesterday with the city archaeologists, who I just met personally because it was during COVID times when I would send him emails and be like, well, you have a map of this. And, well, why do you need a map? I was like, because I want to see like what people are actually seeing in their neighborhood, right? If you're in Hyde Park, for instance, for the Trotter book, where he spends his childhood, why did he call it like a refuge when he was like in his 30s and struggling as an activist, and would talk about going into Hyde Park? Well, it's because Hyde Park was like countryside, and people still had a well in the neighborhood, and it was a mostly white community, but there were, for the time and for Massachusetts, there were a bunch of black people who were veterans who lived there, who had all their children, and they would all play together on Muddy Brook, right? And you had that, you then see the maps, and you see, well, of course they would go there because their house is here, the brook is like outside. And so when he's talking, we have to take what he's seeing is a city that is very different. And so really going in, again, it's all about the sources, going in, what are people saying about the neighborhood they're living in. We are fortunate enough to live in New England, where people talk about New England all the time, people who live here, right? Whether it's to complain about it or to, exalt it, right? And so you can get lots of descriptions of places and people who lived in those places. And the newspapers of the time are a good thing, right? When people would describe right into the Boston Post and say, I'm living in the West End and the well that used to work doesn't work, and I'm mad because there's rats and there's mud. And so that might tell you something about the way this West End looked, right? Very different than now where Mass General is, right? And very different than what we even would think of if we got like a photograph that was taken like in 1910. Oh, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greenidge, for your incredible talk and for answering all of our questions. And thank you to all who joined us and tuned in from afar. Our Author Talk series will be taking a summer break, so check our website or sign up for the library newsletter for updates. We will return in September. And thank you again, Dr. Greenidge. And if you're interested in purchasing a copy of her book, they're available in the back. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.